31, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion at second reading stage of Bill S210 under private members' business. Call in the members. The question is as follows. Madame Vecchio, appuyée par Madame.
Mrs. Vecchio, seconded by Mrs. Veen, moved that Bill S210, an act to restrict young persons' online access to sexually explicit material, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security.
La période de
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote. We will start with the sponsor of the item. We will now proceed to members participating in person. All those at my left in favour of the motion will please rise.
Those at my left opposed to the motion will please rise. Sixth row, fifth row, fourth row, third row, second row, first row. All those at my right opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Lewis, Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis, Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Madame Chatel.
Madame Chatel.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Ms. Kayabaga.
Ms. Kayabaga.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Fifth row at my right.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Monsieur Robillard.
Monsieur Robillard.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Mr. Sobara.
Mr. Sobara.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Baker.
Mr. Baker.
Ms. Latanzio.
Ms. Latanzio.
Fourth row at my right.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Briard.
Madame Briard.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Troisième rangée à ma droite.
Third row at my right.
Dhaliwal.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Mrs. Romanato.
Mrs. Romanato.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
Deuxième rangée à ma
Second row at my right.
Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Monsieur Vandal.
Monsieur Vandal.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mrs. Valdez.
Ms. Jazek.
Ms. Jazzer.
Madame Fautier.
Madame
première rangée à ma droite.
First row at my right.
Mr. O'Regan.
Mr. O'Regan.
Ms. Gould.
Ms. Gould.
Monsieur Boissonneau.
Mr. Boissonneau.
Mr. Varani.
Mr. Varani.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
La Chambre attendra mais
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
je désire informer la
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them.
Le bureau va maintenant compiler les
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Nays pour 189, 189. Nays contre 133, 133.
Je déclare la motion adoptée.
I declare the motion carried.